And so the pediatric societies are now recommending limiting fruit juice to children, and this idea of like limiting 6-year-olds children and under to 4 to 6 ounces a day, and for children over 6 to 8 ounces a day probably makes very much sense, because if you do drink large amounts of juice, you dramatically increase your chances for becoming obese. And so here's an example where natural fruit juices may not be so good. On the other hand, if you eat a natural fruit, you don't actually get that much fructose from a fruit, maybe only 6 to 8 grams, and you eat it slower, and it's also associated with antioxidants, fiber, potassium, resveratrol, and other very good compounds, vitamin C, that help block the effects of fructose. So it looks like natural fruits themselves are probably better than, fruit juices. Now, when I originally wrote my book, I was concerned that you could eat, that if you eat a large amounts even of natural fruits, you could get into trouble. And I have had cases where people were eating very large amounts of natural fruits, and when I cut it out or reduced it, they had dramatic weight loss. So I've had a number of people like this who, are eating almost a pure fruit diet, and I don't think that that's particularly good. But I think that the normal individual eating 2 to 4 natural fruits a day probably is going to be fine.
Well, it would seem to me that there's obviously genetic variability, that some people, in fact, may tolerate larger amounts of fruits for a variety of different reasons. And to me, it would seem, and I'd like to run this by you, a reasonable approach to use uric acid as a marker to identify your susceptibility. In other words, if you happen to be one of these individuals who are passionate, love fruit, and you seem to do well with it, and you suffer perhaps one of these the symptoms or consequences you mentioned earlier, that do you think it's wise to try that and just measure your uric acid level? And if in fact you're above 5, or if you really want to become obsessive, 4.0 if you're a man or 3.0 if you're a woman, then you may want to consider, or 3.5, you may want to consider lowering your level until you're able to get to those optimize your uric acid levels.
You're right on, Joe. We actually have some evidence from our laboratory that uric acid actually regulates the sensitivity to fructose. So the higher your uric acid, the more sensitive you are to the effects of fructose. Now, we haven't published this yet, but the data looks very convincing in the laboratory. And so we even have some data in people that would support that. So I agree with you. If you actually measure your serum uric acid, and if it's very significantly high, you probably will get into more trouble with fruit juices and large amounts of fruit than other individuals will. That seems to be the take-home message from our current research.
And I also have another comment on the fruit juice. But before I mention, I want to state that I am not a fan of fruit juice, and I personally avoid it, and I don't recommend or advise people to use it. However, I'd like to play the devil's advocate, and even though the expert committees that you mentioned earlier, or referenced earlier, advised avoid using fruit juices, I'm wondering that, the assumption is made that all fruit juices are the same. And, my understanding of the most commercial fruit juices is that that's not the case. In fact, a lot of them, play deceptive games with the labeling, and there may only be a small amount of fruit, or even in, I think 10 years ago, or apple juice, the case where almost all the commercial suppliers of apple juice was being spiked with high fructose corn syrup. So there's a huge difference between a commercial one and one that you're going to make in your home in a juicer.
Yes, so you're absolutely right. Many, many juices are not pure natural fruit juices. In many, many cases, they're adding sugar or high fructose corn syrup. And so that, right off the bat, those kinds of juices are very bad, but then in addition, the actual type of fruit may make a difference. And so, for example, pear juice and apple juice is very, very low in vitamin C, but very, very high in fructose. And so those particular kinds of juices may be worse than like orange juice or grapefruit juice that have a high amount of vitamin C. So that's kind of the counter aspect. Now, apples contain other compounds like quercetin, which is an antioxidant that may block some of fructose effects. So, the verdict is still out in terms of which juice is better and which juice is worse. But in general, apple juice and pear juice would be I would be more concerned about those types of juices because they are very, very high in sugar or fructose and relatively low in antioxidants.
Now, another idea or concept I received from our last interaction was the fact that glucose, which is the other half of sucrose, which is common table sugar, is relatively safe. It is metabolized in completely different pathways and does not produce the same metabolic abnormalities as fructose does. And I'm wondering, with your research or review of the literature, if your recommendations on using glucose as a sweetener. Now, for those of you who aren't familiar, you cannot buy glucose commercially. It doesn't say glucose, but you can get it as a product called dextrose, and it's relatively inexpensive. It's only about $1 a pound. So it's not as sweet as table sugar or certainly fructose, but it doesn't seem to cause the problems. And I'm wondering if what your research has shown is with respect to long-term complications of that in moderation.
Okay, so it is absolutely true that if you take a laboratory animal and you feed it glucose or dextrose or starch, it will not get into trouble. It will stay skinny. It will stay healthy. And rice diets are high in starch and historically been associated with being lean and so forth in people as well. In contrast, if you give sugar or fructose to an animal, they'll rapidly develop features of metabolic syndrome, obesity, and so forth. And you can pair feed animals. So one animal can get exactly the same number of calories as the other one, but it's only the sucrose or sugar or fructose fed animals that will develop the features of metabolic syndrome. This makes one believe that starches are safe. And this is, in fact, what I wrote in the book. Now, as we've done more studies, obviously, if you're diabetic, giving glucose is not good because in diabetes, you cannot handle glucose metabolism. And when you eat glucose, your blood glucose levels will go up. And this is what this is a manifestation of not being able to make enough insulin, or of having insulin that is, having insulin-resistant really? Tissues. So in the diabetic, you don't want to give starches or glucose, without, really monitoring the effects of it on your blood glucose and adjusting your insulin accordingly. Now, one of the things that we're just discovering in the laboratory, and actually it's been known, but we're trying to figure out how important it is. But in people who are diabetic and in people who are severely insulin resistant, where their blood glucose goes up after a meal much higher than a normal person, they can make fructose from the glucose. And there's a pathway called the polyol. It's called the polyol pathway. And we are now studying it, and we do think that there is an endogenous fructose pathway. We don't know how important it is yet, but we do know that you can make fructose from glucose, especially if you're diabetic, or if you're severely insulin resistant. Since a lot of people who are very, very overweight and are trying to lose weight, some of them can be insulin resistant. This does throw a new twist into the story. We're trying to figure out the impact of this. But certainly if you're not insulin resistant, dextrose or starch is going to be good.
Interesting. And do you believe that dextrose in limited quantities contributes to insulin resistance,
No.
Unless perhaps they have this activated polyol pathway which goes to fructose, which would.
Yeah, but then you are insulin resistant.
Okay, so that's that's only in insulin resistant individuals.
Right. So our data is unequivocal. Starch does not cause obesity. Dextrose does not cause obesity. Starch does not cause diabetes. Glucose does not cause diabetes. Fructose, though, can cause diabetes.